mistake, or manslaughter? Where do we draw the line? When does a medical error become a criminal act? Well, in just a little bit, we're going to talk about that. There's been a case that's been in the news media lately, and it's been all over social media in certain circles. But we're going to talk about when does a mistake become criminal negligence and when can it be charged. Stay tuned. So before we begin, I want to talk about a case that I was at that was a near accident or a near miss as far as medication administration errors. As part of my roles at where I work is I'm a field training officer and I onboard new and graduate paramedics. And part of the process is I like to try and put the paramedics through their paces, try and put them through some worst case scenarios. And one of the situations, I had a very bright medic, very smart, very intelligent, very knowledgeable, and very diligent about his work. We had a patient who was nauseous. So while he was doing the IV, I was being the helpy helperton. And I pulled out the vial and handed to him for an antiemetic. Now, the vial that I pulled out was intentionally not Zofran. It was diphenhydramine or Benadryl. And the reason I chose this medication is because even though this medication isn't really what's indicated under protocol, it may have some antiemetic properties and benefit, and otherwise it's also fairly harmless in the event of an error. But my intention wasn't for it to ever get to that point. So I hand the vial to my trainee. He looks at the vial. I'm thinking, oh boy, he's got me now. He reads off the vial, except he says ondansetron and recites the proper dosing and administration for the medication. He draws up the medication, takes another look at the vial, and I'm thinking, oh, but now he checked twice. Now he's really got it. Double checked, put the vial down, and was about to connect the lure lock to administer the medication when I called a safety timeout. But check that vial again. You see, our minds play tricks on us. When we're expecting to see a certain medication, we're going to see that medication because that's what our mind is telling us we're expecting to see. Sometimes it takes a really thorough check to override that cognitive anticipation. And that's how sometimes medication administration errors occur. He knew what the correct medication was. He looked at the medication vial and his mind told him this is what it is. So he had actually a very good learning opportunity, and I guarantee you he will never make that mistake again. Now he's conscious of the fact that your mind can play tricks on you. And I'm sure he's going to go off and be a fantastic paramedic. So these mistakes can and do occur in all fields. But we're going to talk about a specific case. In this particular case, we had an older female who had been admitted for an intraparenchymal hematoma, as well as some hypertension, some vision issues, and some atrial fibrillation. But she was admitted to the neuro ICU, and she was doing well. In fact, she was moved down to the neuro ICU step-down unit, which is like a neuro ICU junior. And she was doing so well, in fact, that they were planning on discharging her from the ICU to a standard med-surg floor. There was just one thing they had to do. They just had to do a PET scan before sending her off on her way. So this was really the last object that they needed to do before they could move her. So they took her down to PET scan, and she was in PET scan in either the holding area or the hallway when she mentioned to the nurse, I feel a bit anxious about the PET scan. And I apologize in advance about the grumpy nurse clip art. It just happens to be the clip art I had. But she complained about feeling some anxiety about going into the MRI. So, if you're anxious, especially with the claustrophobia, you really might need something before you go in. Otherwise, you might not be able to complete the scan. So the nurse called up and said, if she's too anxious for the PET scan, she's either going to have to reschedule for another day, because we've got a full schedule and we can't wait. She's got to have that radiological tracer put in and everything like that. She's either going to have to reschedule or going to have to do something for anxiety. And we don't have the staff and the equipment to properly and safely sedate her and monitor her. So at this point, the doctor says, let me see if I can fix that. She thinks, I better order her some Versed, which is a not unreasonable option. I mean, Versed does have some anxiolytic properties. It's not typically your first choice for most anxiolysis, but it is something that's relatively fast-acting and effective. So she goes and she puts it into the billing software, the patient software, Freudian slip there, and this order then gets reviewed a couple minutes later by the hospital pharmacist, who says, let's see, midazolam, 2 milligrams, yep, no interactions, this is a safe med to give, you've got the A-OK. Now, so they call this over to the ICU and say, hey, we've got this med to give. The patient's nurse is unable to do it because she's got a couple other patients. So she's got other responsibilities. She can't go running off to radiology to give a med and monitor the patient and everything like that. However, the ICU has what they call a help-all nurse, which is sort of like an ICU float type nurse who goes around and helps out wherever it's needed. So this ICU help-all nurse happens to have a preceptee with her, showing the new student, the ways and how to do things, etc. So she goes over to the Pyxis, and on the Pyxis, she goes in, puts the patient's information there. Let's see, Versed. Oh man, it's not in the computer system. Gosh darn computers, can't ever trust them. Versed's not in here. All right, well, let's see here. You know what? I'm just going to override this. So they push override button, and they get to the manual drug entry screen for that patient. So let's see here, Versed. That would be a V and an E. All right, here we go. We've got Versed, top one. All right, here we go. Select and override. And I should probably note that the first medication on the list wasn't Versed, but we'll keep going. So the screen pops up. It says, warning, you're about to override. Are you sure? Make sure it's the right thing. This, for stat orders, etc., etc. Are you sure? Yeah, sure. No one ever reads this stuff anyways, except, and, pulled the medication. So the medication that she was expecting to get was Versed, also known by the generic name of midazolam. So on the left is what she was expecting, and on the right is what she actually pulled. And can anyone tell the difference between these two? If you said that the one on the left has a reflection and the one on the right doesn't, well, you're actually technically correct. But more importantly, the difference is these are two different classes of medications. One is a sedative, one is not a sedative. But you got the one on the right. So the one on the right, if you were to look at the label, it says vecuronium bromide. And right underneath that, in the smallest print, is what the nurse read, is what was in the smallest print at the very bottom, which is the instructions for how to reconstitute, which says 1 milligram per ml when reconstituted 10 mLs. Huh, that's weird. Never had to reconstitute Versed before. I don't even know if they make a reconstitute form of that. I did a quick look. I didn't see any formularies that have a reconstitute version of Versed. In theory, I guess you could probably do a custom formulary on it, but no one has real reconstitute Versed that I've seen anywhere. Huh, that's weird. Common ICU medication, now you have to reconstitute it. That's weird. Should I recheck that label? You know what? I'm sure it's fine. So she goes ahead, draws up the fluids for reconstituting the medication, and injects it right there, right through the stopper, right around that red rim, just right into the bottle to reconstitute the medication. So she draws this up, and in fairness, she properly labels the bag, saying Versed 1 to 2 milligrams, PET scan. So she takes the little baggie and goes down to the PET scan. It takes a little bit to find it because she's not used to going down to that department. So in PET scan, they don't have barcode scanners to scan the patient, scan the med, make sure it's correct. It's something that's rolling out as part of their Epic EHR rollout, but it hasn't gotten yet to the radiology department. So you have to do this manually. So she came down, found the patient sitting in the hallway, came in, gave some of the med, and left. So, like a magic benzo fairy, came in, sprinkled the benzos, and off she went. So you might already be seeing some of the potential issues here. So let me explain to you a little bit about vecuronium bromide. Vecuronium is, like I said, not a sedative. In fact, it is a non-depolarizing neuromuscular blocker. What that means in regular terms is it's a paralytic medication. You are entirely conscious, you're just paralyzed. And what this would look like and what this would feel like to the patient is that after about 2 to 5 minutes is usually the time of onset for action for this, you would start to feel some heaviness in your extremities and your limbs, and then it will gradually progress towards your core to the point where you can't feel like you can't move your muscles at all. You can't turn your head, you can't blink, you can't move, and gradually it paralyzes your other muscles in your torso as well, specifically your respiratory muscles. And you're entirely conscious, awake, and aware that you can no longer breathe, but you can't move, you can't call out for help. And if you think you were anxious before, imagine how anxious you are when you are smothering yourself to death and you can't call out for help. This is a horrific way to die. But so a transport person going by the hallway within the next half hour walks by and says, the patient's no longer breathing. Knocks on the door, says, hey, just so you know, that patient in the hall, yeah, they're not breathing, FYI. So they say, oh my God, they call code blue, and they start resuscitating the patient. Actually, it might have been a rapid response, come to think of it. Called rapid response down to the PET scan, and they're working on resuscitating the patient. Start compressions, start ventilations. After a couple rounds of CPR and intubation, they get pulses back. So, this sends off some alarm bells saying, hey, wait a minute. We just brought a patient down to PET scan, and now could this be for our patient? So they call down and find out, yes, this is indeed for the patient. So the patient's primary nurse, got the bag back from the help out nurse, and she took a looked at the medication and said, wait a minute, that's not Versed. So, unfortunately, it turns out that medication was a paralytic and not a sedative. And what do you do in that situation? Well, I imagine what I would do in some situation similar to that is, well, it's an uncomfortable conversation and something you have to bring up to your own department, risk management, and certainly a lot of paperwork involved with it. So there was some immediate fallout from this. And the fallout was that the nurse self-reported the error, which is absolutely appropriate, and then the nurse was fired. There was an investigation, they looked into it, they took her off the schedule, put her on administrative leave, and after their review, they felt that the nature of this nurse's error warranted termination. So the nurse was fired, and the county medical examiner was never notified. They said, well, there's no evidence that vecuronium was given. It's hearsay, and the way that it was documented in the chart, the nurse was told not to put it into the chart, that it would be automatically flagged in the EHR somehow somewhere else with a different color. So they didn't see it in the chart. They said, oh, well, neuro ICU patient decompensated and died, a couple days later. Yeah, this is something that's, foreseeable. The family was never notified of the medication error, and only found out a year later. CMS was never notified, and also importantly, the Tennessee Department of Health was never notified about their. These are all some of the requirements of things that you're supposed to do. So, as you can imagine, CMS was pissed. So they did an investigation, and in the course of their investigation, they turned around and said to Vanderbilt, hey, your reimbursement's on the line for this, because it wasn't just so much the medication error. It was what they perceived as a cover-up after the fact. So their conclusions of the investigation was that the nurse violated policy by overriding the medication dispensing cabinet. It's only supposed to be for stat medications and under certain conditions, and they felt that this did not qualify according to the hospital policy as one. And they also felt that the nurse violated policy by failing to have a second RN verify and override on what was classified as a high-risk medication, which was Versed, and what technically the vecuronium was also a high risk. So either way, it's a goof up on that part. They also felt that the nurse violated policy by not monitoring the patient after a high-risk med administration, as required by hospital policy. And she neglected to administer the medication that was ordered. So hospital policy is one thing, but there's also a nursing standard of care that says, even in the nursing manual, it says that you'll monitor your patient for the effect of the medication. And ultimately what they concluded was that the nurse violated the nursing standards of care. So they severely criticized the care that the patient got from the nursing staff. And the result? Well, this was the letter that they sent to Vanderbilt. They said, "Notice is hereby given that effective December 9th, the agreement between Vanderbilt University Medical Center and the Secretary of Health and Human Services as provider of hospital services in the health insurance for the aged and disabled program, aka Medicare, is to be terminated. Vanderbilt University Medical Center does not meet the following conditions of participation: patient rights and nursing services. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has determined that Vanderbilt University Medical Center is not in compliance with the conditions of participation. The Medicare program will not make payment for hospital services to patients who are admitted after December 9th, 2018. And that's huge. About 22 to 25% of that hospital's revenue came from Medicare payments on Medicare patients. If you're banned from Medicare, that is essentially the kiss of death for almost all institutions. It's a huge loss. So you never want to be that person who costs your agency or your company your Medicare reimbursement. So that was back last year when that came out. And there was some initial discussion about it, about the error, and things went on their way. However, things have recently changed to cause us to resurface once again in social media, and that is that the nurse was indicted on a reckless homicide charge by the prosecutor. Once the prosecution found out about this cover-up and what this nurse did, charges were levied about reckless homicide. And reckless homicide may sound like an extreme charge, but the way that Tennessee law is worded, it states reckless homicide is reckless killing of another, which is fairly vague and fairly succinct. And it's a Class D felony, which under guidelines say sentencing is about 2 to 12 years, if I recall. So that's what she was charged with. And I think that the part of the reason she was charged with that was they're looking for a plea deal to what I think would probably be the more applicable charge of criminally negligent homicide, which is criminally negligent conduct that results in death constitutes criminally negligent homicide. And that's a Class E felony. That's sentencing is 1 to 6 years on that. And they felt that with all the violations, the overrides, the bypassing of safety protocols, the violations of nursing standards of care, and failure to do what they would consider, and I think most would consider, reasonable nursing conduct and precautions, led them to charge her with a crime. So the question is, what do you think? Do you think this particular nurse's actions and inactions amount to a crime? Does it rise to the level of being criminally negligent? Well, let me know what you think below. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts. My thoughts personally, I think the charges are probably warranted with the extreme deviations from policies and all the missed opportunities for all she had to do was one thing, and that would never have happened. In several places, obeyed any of several policies that were in place. But under the just culture model, one could say that this provider's actions amounted to reckless behavior, which under just culture you still face severe sanctions. But let me know what you think. Was this criminal, or was this a mistake?